The warm May morning of 1943 found Field Marshal Erich von Manstein at his Army Group South headquarters near Zaporozhye, studying reconnaissance photographs that documented Soviet defensive preparations around the Kursk salient of scale and sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about the upcoming German offensive. The photographs showed trench systems extending to depths of over 100 kilometers, anti-tank ditches measuring kilometers in length, artillery positions prepared in multiple defensive belts, and minefields of density that exceeded anything previously encountered on the Eastern Front. General Walter Model, commanding the Ninth Army that would attack the northern face of the salient, had received similar intelligence from his reconnaissance units and had transmitted assessments to Field Marshal Günther von Kluge's Army Group Center headquarters, warning that Soviet defensive preparations suggested they knew exactly where and when German attacks would occur. The intelligence reaching these senior commanders through spring 1943 documented that the Soviets were not preparing counteroffensive, but were constructing defensive systems designed specifically to blunt the German offensive that Hitler had ordered against the Kursk salient, raising the question of whether Operation Citadel should proceed when the enemy had clearly anticipated German intentions and had prepared accordingly. The genesis of Operation Citadel traced to March 1943, when Field Marshal von Manstein had proposed limited offensive to pinch off the Kursk salient, eliminate Soviet forces within it, and shorten German defensive lines. The original concept had called for immediate execution while Soviet forces were still recovering from winter fighting and before defensive preparations could be completed. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, had supported Manstein's proposal as operationally sound if executed quickly. Yet Hitler's decision to delay the offensive to allow newer Panther tanks and Ferdinand tank destroyers to be deployed meant that the attack would not occur until July, giving Soviet forces months to prepare defenses that intelligence was now revealing existed in extraordinary depth and strength. General Model had been among the first senior commanders to recognize that Soviet defensive preparations threatened the success of Operation Citadel. Model's reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the defenses north of Kursk beginning in April, and his intelligence officers had compiled assessments showing that Soviet forces were constructing defensive positions specifically oriented to counterattacks from the north. Major General Rudolf Hofmann, Model's chief of staff, had analyzed the intelligence and had calculated that Soviet defensive depth exceeded German offensive capability to penetrate, that even if initial defenses were breached, the multiple defensive belts behind them would prevent operational breakthrough. Model had transmitted these assessments to von Kluge and had recommended either canceling Operation Citadel or fundamentally revising its objectives. The detailed reconnaissance that Model had ordered provided specific information about Soviet defensive dispositions that shaped his assessment of Citadel's prospects. Major General Rudolf Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorff, commanding 47th Panzer Corps under Model, had sent reconnaissance teams to observe Soviet positions from forward observation posts and had received reports documenting concentric defensive rings around key terrain, anti-tank strongpoints covering all likely German avenues of approach, and reverse slope positions where Soviet defenders could engage German armor from defilade. Von Gersdorff had briefed Model that his corps faced defensive system designed by competent military professionals who understood German offensive doctrine and had prepared specifically to counter it. General Joachim Lemelsen, commanding 47th Panzer Corps under Model, had conducted terrain analysis using maps overlaid with intelligence about Soviet positions and concluded that natural terrain features like ravines and ridges had been integrated into Soviet defensive system to create obstacles that would channel German armor into predetermined killing zones.
Lemelsen had reported to his corps commander that his division could penetrate the first defensive line, but that subsequent defensive belts were positioned to prevent exploitation, and that Soviet defensive doctrine had clearly evolved beyond simple linear defense to defense in depth with prepared counterattack positions. Lieutenant General Friedrich Kühner, commanding 57th Panzer Corps under Model, had received intelligence from prisoner interrogations indicating that Soviet soldiers defending positions north of Kursk had been extensively briefed on German offensive intentions and timing. The prisoners had described defensive preparations conducted since April, including digging anti-tank ditches, laying minefields, constructing bunkers, and rehearsing defensive positions against expected German attacks. Kühner had reported to Model that Soviet defensive preparations reflected knowledge of German plans that suggested either German operational security had been compromised or Soviet intelligence had deduced German intentions from troop movements and logistics preparations. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, serving as Inspector General of Armored Troops, had reviewed intelligence about Soviet preparations and concluded that attacking prepared defenses with new tank models that had not been adequately tested was recipe for disaster. Guderian had visited Model's headquarters in early May and had examined the reconnaissance photographs showing Soviet defensive works. Guderian's assessment was that the Panthers and Ferdinands that Hitler insisted must be deployed before Citadel began were mechanically unreliable and tactically unsuited for the breakthrough operations that Citadel required. Guderian had argued directly to Hitler that the offensive should be cancelled, that the new armor should be husbanded for defensive operations, and that attacking into obvious Soviet trap would squander German armored strength for minimal gains. Colonel General Hermann Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army that would attack from the south, had received intelligence assessments from Lieutenant General Friedrich Fangohr, his chief of staff, documenting Soviet defensive preparations opposite his sector. The assessments described anti-tank strongpoints positioned to cover likely German avenues of advance, artillery positions prepared with interlocking fields of fire, and reserves positioned to counterattack any German penetration. Hoth had expressed confidence that his panzer forces could break through Soviet defenses, but had acknowledged that the depth of Soviet defensive system meant that breakthrough would require sustained offensive operations over days or weeks rather than the rapid penetration that original Citadel planning had envisioned. The southern sector intelligence had revealed defensive preparations comparable to the sophistication that faced Model's 9th Army. General Otto von Knobelsdorff, commanding 48th Panzer Corps that would spearhead Hoth's attack, had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs showing Soviet defensive positions organized around the village of Oboyan, which represented 4th Panzer Army's primary objective. Knobelsdorff had noted to Fangohr that Soviet engineers had transformed favorable defensive terrain into fortress, that every hill and ridge had been fortified, and that approaches were covered by multiple defensive positions that would require methodical reduction rather than rapid penetration. Major General Dietrich von Saucken, commanding the 4th Panzer Division under Knobelsdorff, had personally conducted reconnaissance flights over Soviet positions in mid-June and had reported observing anti-tank ditches extending for kilometers, trench systems connecting defensive strongpoints, and artillery positions prepared in multiple echelons. Von Saucken had briefed Knobelsdorff that his division's attack would face defensive firepower of intensity not previously experienced on the Eastern Front. Lieutenant General Hermann Breith, commanding 3rd Panzer Corps under Hoth, had received intelligence from his division commanders documenting that Soviet defensive preparations opposite his sector included extensive minefields that aerial reconnaissance suggested exceeded 100 miles per kilometer of front. Major General Johannes Basler, commanding the 6th Panzer Division, had reported that engineer reconnaissance had detected multiple belts of minefields, that clearing lanes through the mines would require time under Soviet artillery fire, and that the minefields were integrated with anti-tank defenses positioned to engage German armor as it concentrated to pass through cleared lanes.
General Karl Adolf Hulett, commanding forces adjacent to the Kursk salient, had observed Soviet defensive construction through spring and had reported to Manstein that the scale of fortification effort suggested Soviet command had allocated significant resources and engineer assets to defensive preparations. Hulett had noted that Soviet work parties had been observed continuously improving defensive positions through May and June, that defensive depth was increasing weekly, and that Soviet defenders appeared confident and well prepared, rather than showing the demoralization that earlier German intelligence had suggested characterized Soviet forces after winter setbacks. General Otto von Knobelsdorff, commanding 48th Panzer Corps under Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, had personally flown reconnaissance missions over Soviet positions in June and had reported that defensive preparations visible from the air represented only portion of the defensive system, that Soviet forces had clearly prepared positions in depth that aerial reconnaissance could not fully reveal. Knobelsdorff had briefed Hoth that his corps could achieve initial penetration, but that exploitation beyond the first defensive belt would face increasingly organized resistance from reserves that Soviet command was clearly holding for counterattack once German offensive exhausted itself. General Walther Nehring, commanding Grossdeutschland Division in Model's 9th Army, had compiled reports from his division commanders documenting that Soviet positions north of Kursk were more heavily fortified than German positions along the entire Eastern Front. Major General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding elements under Nehring, had reported that aerial reconnaissance and ground observation revealed Soviet trenches, bunkers, and obstacles extending as far as could be observed, suggesting defensive depth that his division lacked the strength to penetrate, even if initial assaults succeeded. Nehring had transmitted these assessments to Model with recommendation that 9th Army's attack be supported by far greater concentration of artillery than current planning envisioned. Field Marshal von Klug, commanding Army Group Center, had received Model's warnings about Soviet defensive preparations, but had been caught between his subordinates' operational concerns and Hitler's insistence that Citadel proceed. Klug had visited Model's headquarters in early June and had examined the intelligence personally. Klug's assessment was that Model's concerns were legitimate, but that canceling Citadel at this stage would represent admission that Germany had lost offensive capability on the Eastern Front. Klug had attempted to convince Hitler to authorize earlier attack date before Soviet defenses could be completed further, but Hitler had insisted that Panthers and Ferdinands must be available in sufficient numbers before offensive began. General Rudolf Schmidt, commanding 2nd Panzer Army adjacent to the Kursk salient, had observed Soviet defensive preparations through spring and had concluded that the extensive fortification effort indicated Soviet command expected German offensive and had decided to defeat it through defense rather than through immediate counteroffensive. Schmidt had noted to his staff that Soviet defensive strategy represented sophisticated understanding of German operational methods, that preparing defenses in extraordinary depth demonstrated Soviet confidence that defense would succeed, and that successful defense would create conditions for Soviet counteroffensive that would catch German forces exhausted and overextended. Lieutenant General Theodor Busse, serving as operations officer at OKH, had compiled intelligence assessments from all sectors around Kursk and had produced estimate that Soviet forces within and around the salient numbered over 1 million troops, possessed over 3,000 tanks, and were supported by artillery and air power in quantities that exceeded German offensive capabilities. Busse's estimate had been presented to Zeitzler and had included recommendation that Operation Citadel be cancelled because Soviet defensive preparations had eliminated the surprise and rapid breakthrough that the operation required to succeed. Zeitzler had forwarded the recommendation to Hitler, along with his own assessment that Citadel should proceed despite Soviet preparations, creating contradiction that reflected uncertainty at highest levels of German command. General Joachim Lemelsen, commanding 47th Panzer Corps under Hoth, had conducted map exercises in June using intelligence about Soviet defensive positions and had concluded that his corps could penetrate the first defensive belt, but would suffer casualties that would prevent exploitation to operational depth. Lemelsen had briefed Hoth that Soviet defensive system was designed to channel German attacks into killing zones where Soviet artillery and anti-tank weapons could engage from prepared positions, that Soviet defenders would exact heavy price for any German advances, and that the cost-benefit ratio of the offensive was unfavorable even if tactical objectives were achieved. Colonel General Hans-Valentin Hube, commanding 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Hoth, had reviewed intelligence about Soviet tank reserves positioned behind the defensive belts and had assessed that Soviet command was prepared to conduct mobile defense using armor to counterattack German penetrations. Hube had noted that Soviet tank corps identified in the Kursk area were equipped with T-34 tanks in quantities that matched or exceeded German armored strength, that air reconnaissance had detected assembly areas suggesting Soviet forces intended active defense rather than passive resistance, and that German forces should expect operational-level counterattacks once Citadel began.
General Werner Kempf, commanding Army Detachment Kempf that would protect 4th Panzer Army's eastern flank, had received intelligence that Soviet forces opposite his sector had prepared defensive positions of similar depth to those facing Hoth's main attack. Major General Franz Mattenklott, Kempf's chief of staff, had calculated that Kempf's forces were inadequate to break through Soviet defenses while simultaneously protecting Hoth's flank, that Soviet defensive preparations suggested they understood German operational plan and had positioned forces to exploit the weakness in German dispositions that Kempf's limited strength represented. The intelligence about Soviet defensive preparations had reached Hitler through multiple channels, through formal intelligence summaries from Galen's Foreign Armies East, through operational assessments from Army Group commanders, through after-action reports from reconnaissance units, and through prisoner interrogations that revealed Soviet soldiers' confidence in their defensive positions. Each channel had conveyed the same basic message. Soviet forces knew German offensive was coming, knew where it would strike, had prepared defenses specifically designed to defeat it, and possessed strength to conduct counteroffensive once German attack exhausted itself. The May 4th conference at Hitler's headquarters, where senior commanders had debated whether to proceed with Citadel, had revealed the depth of concern among operational-level commanders. Model had argued forcefully that attacking into prepared defenses violated principles of armored warfare and would consume German panzer strength for minimal gain. Manstein had expressed confidence that 4th Panzer Army could achieve breakthrough, but had acknowledged that Soviet defensive preparations exceeded initial planning assumptions. Guderian had insisted that husbanding armor for defensive operations was strategically sounder than expending it in offensive that intelligence indicated would fail. Zeitzler had supported proceeding with Citadel despite concerns. Hitler had decided to continue planning, but had delayed execution further to allow more Panthers to arrive. The June conferences, where attack timing had been debated, had shown continuing tension between operational commanders' concerns about Soviet preparations and Hitler's political determination to achieve offensive success. General Adolf Heusinger,
Busse's superior, as chief of the OKH operations department, had presented intelligence showing that every week of delay allowed Soviet forces to strengthen defenses further, that the defenses photographed in April had been reinforced in May and strengthened again in June. Heusinger's assessment was that if Citadel was to proceed at all, it should begin immediately before Soviet preparations were completed, but that canceling the operation remained the better option. General Walther Wenck, serving on the OKH operations staff, had analyzed logistics implications of attacking Soviet defenses of the depth that intelligence revealed. Wenck's calculations showed that ammunition expenditure required to reduce Soviet defenses would exceed stockpiles available, that casualty rates from attacking prepared positions would deplete German infantry faster than replacements could arrive, and that tank losses from Soviet anti-tank defenses would eliminate German armored advantage within days of offensive beginning. Wenck's analysis supported recommendations to cancel Citadel, but was overruled by Hitler's determination to proceed. Colonel Georg von Sodenstern, serving as von Kluge's chief of staff at Army Group Center, had compiled assessments from Model's 9th Army and from reconnaissance units operating around Kursk's northern face. Sodenstern's reports to von Kluge had emphasized that Model's concerns were supported by concrete intelligence, that the Soviet defensive system was real and was specifically designed to defeat 9th Army's attack, and that proceeding with Citadel meant accepting that German forces would attack into defenses where Soviet defenders held every advantage. Sodenstern had recommended that Army Group Center inform Hitler that Citadel could not succeed given Soviet preparations. The July 1st final planning conference had brought together commanders who would execute Citadel, despite near-unanimous recognition that Soviet defensive preparations had eliminated conditions for success. Model had reiterated his concerns, but had accepted that the offensive would proceed and had committed to achieving maximum possible results. Manstein had expressed continued confidence despite Soviet preparations, but had reduced his estimates of how far 4th Panzer Army could advance. Hoth had briefed his attack plan with acknowledgement that penetrating Soviet defenses would require sustained effort. Kempf had requested additional forces that were not available. The conference had concluded with attack date set for July 5th, with all commanders understanding that they would attack into defenses that intelligence had revealed in extraordinary detail. The final intelligence summaries distributed on July 4th had documented that Soviet forces had prepared 8 successive defensive belts extending over 150 kilometers in depth, had emplaced over 400,000 mines, had positioned over 20,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and had concentrated over 3,000 tanks. The summaries had estimated that Soviet forces defending the Kursk salient numbered 1.3 million troops compared to 900,000 German troops preparing to attack. The numbers had made clear that German forces would attack with numerical disadvantage against prepared defenses, a combination that military theory suggested would result in defeat. The recognition among German generals that Soviets were preparing not offensive but defensive system of unprecedented scale and sophistication had come progressively through April, May, and June 1943. Model had understood earliest and most clearly. Guderian had recognized the implications for armored warfare. Manstein had acknowledged the challenge while maintaining confidence in breakthrough. Kluge had accepted that concerns were legitimate, but had deferred to Hitler's determination. The junior commanders, Knobelsdorff, Hornlein, Lemelsen, and Hube, had understood from tactical intelligence that their forces faced extraordinarily difficult missions. The July 1st launch of Operation Citadel had validated the intelligence assessments and the operational concerns. German forces had achieved penetrations measured in kilometers rather than the operational breakthrough measured in tens of kilometers that planning had required. Soviet defensive system had channeled German attacks into killing zones where prepared defenses had exacted casualties that German forces could not sustain. The Soviet counteroffensive that had followed German offensive failure had driven German forces back and had seized initiative that Germany would not regain. The assessment was that German generals had learned through April to June 1943 that Soviets were preparing not offensive but defensive system of unprecedented scale and sophistication, that intelligence had clearly revealed Soviet preparations, that operational level commanders had understood implications and had recommended canceling the offensive, but that strategic level decision-making had proceeded despite intelligence and despite recommendations. The failure represented not inadequate intelligence, but a command system where accurate assessment and sound operational judgment were overruled by political determination to achieve offensive success.